Hello, my name is Kamil Atta. I'm a board certified psychiatrist. I'm practicing currently in Long Island, New York, and I wanted to start this video focusing on social anxiety or social anxiety disorder. So this is going to be part one of the videos, and today I will try to focus on definition of social anxiety or social anxiety disorder. And I just wanted to say that this disorder is of great interest to me, and I find it fascinating. I find it extremely interesting, despite the fact that I'm treating a lot of other psychiatric conditions. And that's why I would like to share my current knowledge, which is based on, reading the research, reading the available literature, observing and talking to other practitioners who have experience in that area, my clinical observation. By that I mean observing my patients. And then my personal experience with some of the elements of the social anxiety, because I believe it's so this issue is so universal, so much more prevalent than people estimate it to be, that it's impossible to avoid experiencing lots of it, even your own. So with that being said, I would like to talk first about the social anxiety disorder, how it's called nowadays. And I will first try to explain all the elements of the phrase, and then I will try to give the definition based on the most current DSM-5 criteria. DSM-5 is essentially what we call a psychiatric Bible, which is a set of guidelines to define psychiatric disorders. And the most current version, is DSM-5, and I'm sure it's going to be modified in the future. There will be DSM-6 and so forth, so on. But for now, we are using DSM-5. So first of all, the three elements is social anxiety disorder. Social means any kind of social interaction that we are in. And typically I divide them into three parts. One is social interaction. By that I mean talking or interacting with somebody. For example, we are at the party and we don't know too many people. The idea of approaching somebody, talking to them, is kind of overwhelming. Then there is an issue of public exposure or public speaking. A situation in which we are to make a speech in front of anywhere from 20 to hundreds of people, and we have to experience those unpleasant feelings. And the third element is being observed. That typically happens in a public setup, such as eating in a restaurant, or being in a public restroom, or any other public facility where you feel that you may be observed. The anxiety piece is the idea of what is anxiety. The anxiety is essentially a fear that we experience in threatening situations. So it's very important to imagine yourself in a threatening situation, really threatening situation. For example, being in a dark alley and about to be assaulted by somebody, or being on the front line of the battlefield, okay? Or for some people being, for example, on the plane and about to skydive. All the situations present themselves with the common element, and that is it's a real threat to our lives. And when that happens, our body typically responds in two ways. Some people say there are three, but generally two ways. We are either fight the threat or run away from the threat. So that's the idea of fight or flight reaction. The third element of response is sometimes not doing anything, freezing. And that can happen if we are so confused as to which option to take. But in either running or fighting, the body goes through very similar phases of reaction, which is our heart begins to race, our thoughts are much faster. Our mouth becomes dry, and I don't know if you ever had a chance to observe public speakers, but very often they have a glass of water next to them in order to drink, and that's partially because their mouth becomes dry when they speak publicly. Our palms become sweaty, our pupils become wide, we breathe faster, and essentially our skin becomes more pale, and essentially all these elements of our body's reaction are to prepare us for one of those options, which is either fighting or running away. Our body wants to be ready. And in the most situations, it makes sense, because if we don't do that, something bad is going to happen. Typically, we're going to die. And the third element of the phrase is disorder, and that means that it's abnormal. And this is more tricky, because what is really abnormal differs according to a person. But the way I like to look at it is the disorder limits you. In other words, if you didn't have it, would you be doing better? Would you be able to reach your full potential? And that's where I look at it. It's not really disorder if you are performing at the optimum capacity. So I really, for example, if somebody is obsessive compulsive and has obsessive compulsive disorder, but at the same time is a top accountant in the country, is it really a disorder? So it's very hard to make a judgment here. But essentially, I like to think of it as not reaching your full potential. And so this is social anxiety disorder. And what are the features? What are the criteria for social anxiety disorder? Is number one is the fear of all the social situations that we can encounter. Sometimes there are more specific situations, sometimes there are many more. For example, if we just focus on social interactions, public speaking, but we don't have a fear of being scrutinized or observed. Nevertheless, the fear is, the anxiety is pronounced, and it's it's a very disturbing feeling, as many of you may know. Number two is that if you are in those situations, you will always have that reaction. So every time I put you, if you are afraid, for example, of social interactions, of public speaking, every time I put you on a stand, you will experience those reactions. Okay, it has to be consistent and always happening. In fact, sometimes even thinking about it is enough to create that fear. Imagining that you're about to speak tomorrow at the public place causes you to have the same reaction, and sometimes developing in a full-fledged panic attack. Okay. The third element has to be understanding by the patient that the fear is irrational or excessive. And the favorite example that I give is my personal example when I was afraid of flying the planes. The idea was that I knew that it doesn't make any sense, because I knew statistically it's so much more likely to die in a car crash than in a plane. In fact, dying in a plane is like winning a lottery ticket almost. And yet, on an emotional level, there was nothing that could change that feeling. I knew I'm not supposed to be afraid, and yet I was. So on the logical level, I knew that I'm not supposed to be afraid. On the emotional level, I'm fully afraid. The next element of the definition is avoiding all those situations that can cause me distress. So for example, if I have an option of going to the party versus not going to a party, I'd rather not go to a party and avoid the distress, because it's uncomfortable. The fifth element, which is very important to define the disorder, is that there has to be some distortion of the level of functioning. And by that, we can create certain scenarios to describe that. For example, if I'm afraid of interactions with authority figures, I will not look for a job even if my job is not fully satisfying, because the fear of going through the interview is so overwhelming that I'm not going to go through with it. Similarly, if I'm single and I'm interested in having a relationship, the fear of interacting with other party is so overwhelming that I'm avoiding it. So therefore, instead of being in a relationship, I remain single, and that's not because I choose to. It's because I avoid the alternative of going out there and possibly being humiliated and rejected. I don't want to do that, so I stay at home and instead browse the internet or watch TV. Okay, so that's the next element. The other element of definition is that the disorder or the feeling has to be more or less 6 months. In the old days it was very strict 6 months. Nowadays it has to be approximately 6 months. So that process, that fear to social situation has to be about 6 months non-stop. Sometimes there are situations when it just happens for a brief moment and then disappears. That's not what social anxiety disorder is. Social anxiety disorder is a very long, typically a lifelong pattern of behavior. And then the last element of the definition is to exclude other possible reasons for your reactions. So make sure that your social anxiety reactions are not related to other psychiatric disorders. It's not related to the medical conditions, or it's not related to external circumstances such as drugs or alcohol. Okay, so if you take all these elements into consideration, that's more or less how the American Psychiatric Association defines social anxiety disorder. And as a guideline, I think it's pretty accurate. Okay, the point, the general point is that it is, the way I describe it is that it's an irrational response to an objectively non-threatening situation. So we are taking that fight or flight response to a situation that objectively doesn't make any sense. And that's why I find it very interesting, because very often this problem affects very logical, high-functioning people who otherwise have no other issues. They are very successful, they are performing at the top of their abilities, and yet when it comes to social situations, they are being quite irrational about it. Okay, so that's the first part, which is focused on definition. And in my next video, I will try to talk about the mechanism of anxiety in general and mechanism of social anxiety, and also maybe about the possible causes of anxiety, social anxiety.